Picture this. Rows of gleaming warriors marching in perfect formation, their polished armor catching the Mediterranean sun, red cloaks flowing dramatically behind them as they advance with mechanical precision. Their equipment is immaculate, their bearing noble, their very presence radiating the invincible power of Rome. This is the Roman legionary of our imagination, the Hollywood hero, the history book icon, the symbol of ancient military perfection. But what if everything you think you know about Roman soldiers is wrong? What if beneath that gleaming exterior lay a story of crushing poverty, unbearable physical burdens, and equipment that was more curse than blessing? What if the mighty Roman Empire was built not on the backs of glamorous warriors, but on the suffering of common men carrying loads that would break modern soldiers? Today, we're going to strip away 2,000 years of mythology and reveal the brutal truth about Roman military life. Using archaeological evidence, ancient payslips, and the soldiers' own letters home, we'll uncover a reality so harsh it will forever change how you see the Roman Empire. This isn't just a story about clothing and equipment. It's about the human cost of conquest, the price of glory, and the men who paid it with their bodies, their health, and often their lives. Prepare yourself for a journey that will shatter every assumption you've ever had about Rome's legendary legions. The truth, as you're about to discover, is far more brutal than any Hollywood epic ever dared to show. To understand the true nature of Roman military suffering, we must travel back to 107 BCE and meet a man whose reforms would doom countless soldiers to lives of backbreaking labor. Gaius Marius, a brilliant but ruthless general, looked at Rome's army and saw inefficiency. The solution he devised would earn Roman soldiers a nickname that reveals everything about their true role in the empire's expansion. Before Marius, Roman armies moved with massive baggage trains, long lines of mules, carts, and servants that slowed military operations to a crawl. Marius had a simple, devastating idea. Why not make the soldiers themselves carry everything they needed? With one stroke of administrative genius, he transformed Roman legionaries from warriors into walking supply depots. The soldiers themselves, with bitter humor, called themselves muli Mariani, Marius's mules. The term wasn't hyperbole, it was a cruel statement of fact. Consider that the average Roman soldier weighed only about 145 pounds. These weren't the massive gym-built warriors of modern action movies. Now imagine that same 145-pound man carrying between 60 and 80 pounds of equipment, with some estimates reaching over 100 pounds when fully loaded for extended campaigns. That's the equivalent of carrying more than half your body weight while marching 20 miles a day across unforgiving terrain. Every aspect of a soldier's existence was strapped to a wooden crossframe called a furca. This wasn't just military equipment, it was their entire world. The sagum, their cloak, doubled as a blanket for sleeping on hard ground. In leather satchels called loculi, they carried cooking pots, repair tools, personal items, and water skins. They were required to carry up to 15 days' worth of food rations. Even when supply trains were available, construction tools for building the fortified camps that Roman armies erected every single night, including the Delabra pickaxe and crescent-shaped shovels, added even more weight to their crushing loads. The Roman military writer Vegetius documented the inhuman training regimen that conditioned soldiers for this burden. Recruits had to march 20 Roman miles in 5 hours at regular pace, then increase to 24 miles at quick step. This wasn't a one-time test. It was repeated 3 times every month, month after month, year after year. The physical transformation was so dramatic that retired veterans could be identified by their extraordinarily developed calf muscles, a permanent brand marking decades of forced marching under crushing loads. But here's the most shocking part. This brutal system worked. The constant strain created what military historians call soft armor, conditioning so complete that the soldiers' entire bodies became unified, efficient machines capable of superhuman endurance. However, military strength reports from around 90 AD found at Vindolanda reveal the true cost. Out of 752 men in one cohort, only 265 were considered fit for active service. The rest had been broken by the relentless physical demands of being human pack animals. Forget everything you think you know about Roman military uniforms. The image of perfectly coordinated bright red tunics and gleaming armor is largely a fantasy created by Hollywood and perpetuated by romanticized artwork. The reality of Roman military clothing was far more mundane, practical, and surprisingly human. One of the most extraordinary glimpses into the daily reality of Roman soldiers comes from an unlikely source, their shopping lists. At Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall, archaeologists discovered wooden tablets containing personal letters between soldiers and their families. These mundane documents contain shocking revelations that humanize these ancient warriors in ways no grand monument ever could. Roman soldiers wore underwear. This might seem trivial, but it represents a profound truth about the gap between myth and reality. One preserved letter contains a request for 2 pairs of sandals and 2 pairs of underpants. Subligaria. Another mentions socks, crucial for soldiers marching endless miles in the cold, wet climate of northern Britain. These weren't the bronze gods of our imagination. They were ordinary men concerned about keeping their feet dry and their private parts covered. The famous red tunics that appear in every Roman movie. Another oversimplification. While red was certainly common, associated with Mars, the god of war, many soldiers wore tunics made from undyed wool, giving them an off-white or natural brown appearance. Dyes were expensive and difficult to produce in large quantities. Roman dyers used madder for red, weld for yellow, and woad for blue. But these colors were often reserved for officers or special occasions. The average legionary's tunic was more likely to be the color of sheep. The reality was that Roman military uniforms varied dramatically based on location, season, unit, and individual resources. A soldier stationed in Britain would dress very differently from one serving in Egypt or Syria. Climate dictated necessity, and necessity trumped any idealized vision of military consistency. Perhaps no piece of Roman military equipment better illustrates the gap between effectiveness and comfort than the caligae, the heavy-soled military sandals that were marvels of engineering and instruments of prolonged torture. These weren't sandals in the modern sense. They were complex constructions of multiple layers of thick leather, with soles studded with iron hobnails for durability and traction. The open design was intended to provide ventilation and prevent the blisters that plagued any walking army. In theory, they were perfect military footwear. In practice, they were instruments of sustained agony. Imagine marching 20 miles a day carrying 80 pounds of equipment and shoes that were essentially leather platforms studded with metal spikes. The rigid construction and hobnailed soles created constant pressure points, leading to bunions, hammer toes, and flat feet. Archaeological evidence suggests that Roman soldiers developed a distinctive gait, a pronounced heel strike and shorter stride, as their bodies adapted to walking in these unforgiving foot prisons. At the fort of Magna, archaeologists discovered colleghi over 30 centimeters long, massive shoes that may have been designed for exceptionally tall soldiers or modified to accommodate thick socks for cold weather. These finds reveal armies constantly adapting their equipment to harsh realities that no parade ground could simulate. When most people think of Roman armor, they picture the iconic lorica segmentata, the segmented plate armor seen in countless movies and documentaries. This uniform, recognizable image is one of history's most successful pieces of propaganda, created by Roman artists and perpetuated by modern media. The reality was far more complex, varied, and problematic. The truth is that Roman armies never had truly standardized equipment. What we see on monuments like Trajan's Column represents idealized propaganda, not battlefield reality. Roman military equipment was a chaotic mix of designs, often borrowed from conquered peoples, adapted for local conditions, and modified by individual preference and availability. The lorica hamata, or chainmail, was actually the most common and enduring form of Roman armor. Made of thousands of interlocked iron rings, it was incredibly heavy, up to 33 pounds, hanging primarily from the shoulders. However, it was nearly indestructible and required minimal maintenance. Soldiers could clean it by simply rolling it in a barrel filled with sand and grit. The famous lorica segmentata, despite its iconic status, was only used from the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, a relatively brief period in Roman military history. While lighter than chainmail at about 20 pounds, it was a maintenance nightmare. The armor consisted of dozens of individual iron plates connected by a complex web of leather strapping, hinges, and bronze fittings. Every piece had to be regularly disassembled, cleaned, oiled, and reassembled to prevent rust and maintain functionality. Imagine being a soldier responsible for maintaining over 30 individual metal plates, dozens of leather ties, and countless metal fittings while living in camps, marching through rain and sweating under the Mediterranean sun. The armor's many joints and attachment points were vulnerable to battle damage, making field repairs a constant concern. Its rigid construction could restrict breathing and movement at critical moments. In 2017, archaeologists at Kalkreis, Germany, the site of the catastrophic Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, made a discovery that perfectly illustrates the vulnerability of Roman equipment. They unearthed the oldest and most complete set of larica segmentata ever found, belonging to a soldier who died in the ambush that annihilated 3 entire Roman legions. The armor, compressed by 2,000 years of acidic soil, looked like a metallic accordion. The complex leather ties and bronze buckles were still visible, but the entire system had collapsed into a corroded mass. Near the armor, archaeologists found a neck shackle, suggesting the soldier had been captured alive before being executed or dying in captivity. This single artifact tells a story of technological ambition meeting brutal reality. The most advanced military equipment of its age, representing hundreds of hours of skilled craftsmanship, had failed to save its wearer. The discovery serves as a physical monument to the gap between Roman military propaganda and the harsh truth of ancient warfare. Perhaps the most shocking truth about Roman military service has nothing to do with physical hardship and everything to do with economic exploitation. While popular culture presents Roman soldiers as well-paid professionals, the reality was a system of institutionalized debt that kept soldiers in perpetual poverty. The Marian reforms promised to provide military equipment at state expense. But this was a cruel fiction. Soldiers didn't receive free equipment. They were forced to buy it through payroll deductions that often consumed their entire salaries. The Roman military operated as a company store, selling soldiers the tools of their trade at prices they could barely afford. The most damning evidence comes from a surviving payslip discovered at Masada, which provides a window into the economic reality of Roman military service. This document shows a soldier's gross pay of 50 denarii for a pay period. From this modest sum, deductions were made for food, 20 denarii, horse fodder, 16 denarii, linen tunic, 7 denarii, caligae, military, sandals, chim denarii, leather straps, do denarii. The final line of the payslip shows the soldier's net pay, 0 denarii, 0, nothing. After working as a professional soldier in the most powerful military force in the ancient world, this man had earned exactly nothing for his service. To understand the full scope of this exploitation, consider the broader economic context. A single pound of imperial purple silk, the color reserved for emperors, cost 150,000 denarii. This was enough to pay the annual salaries of 166 legionaries. The emperor's clothing budget for a single garment exceeded the yearly earnings of an entire century of soldiers. The Roman economy was built on breathtaking inequality, with soldiers occupying the bottom rungs of a system that extracted their labor while keeping them in permanent debt. Many soldiers earned less than civilian laborers or farmers, despite the dangers and hardships of military life. The ultimate incentive for military service was the promise of retirement benefits. After 25 years of service, soldiers were guaranteed either a plot of land or a cash payment equivalent to 10 years' salary. This was the golden carrot that lured men into the legions, the promise that made decades of hardship seem worthwhile. But here's the most sobering statistic of all. Only about half of all Roman soldiers lived long enough to collect their retirement benefits. Disease, combat casualties, accidents, and the simple wear and tear of carrying massive loads for decades killed soldiers faster than the Roman military could replace them. For every veteran who received his promised land grant, another soldier died in a ditch somewhere along the Empire's endless frontiers, his dreams of prosperity buried with his broken body. The retirement promise was essentially a lottery ticket with deadly odds, purchased with 25 years of a man's life. While Roman civilian life was famous for its elaborate bathhouses and sophisticated hygiene practices, Roman soldiers lived in conditions that would shock modern audiences. The gap between civilian luxury and military squalor reveals another layer of the brutal reality behind Roman expansion. In garrison, Roman soldiers cleaned themselves with olive oil and a curved metal scraper called a strigil, since soap was not widely available. This was adequate for removing surface dirt and sweat, but provided little protection against disease or infection. On campaign, even this basic level of cleanliness became impossible. Archaeological evidence from Vindolanda reveals the shocking reality of Roman military hygiene. The barracks floors were covered with bracken, a type of fern used for insulation, and bedding that contained traces of excrement and urine. Soldiers were literally living in their own waste, creating perfect breeding grounds for disease and infection. Water quality was a constant concern that could cripple entire armies. Contaminated water sources could spread dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases that killed more soldiers than enemy weapons. Roman military engineers became experts at identifying clean water sources, not from scientific knowledge, but from hard experience with the deadly consequences of drinking from polluted streams. Waste management in Roman military camps was primitive, at best. Human refuse accumulated faster than it could be disposed of, creating unsanitary conditions that made disease outbreaks inevitable. The close quarters of military life meant that illness spread rapidly through entire units, sometimes rendering whole legions combat ineffective without a single enemy attack. Among all the archaeological evidence of Roman military hardship, nothing humanizes these ancient soldiers more than their own words. The Vindolanda tablets, thin wooden sheets used for correspondence, provide an unfiltered window into the daily concerns, fears, and needs of Roman soldiers stationed on the empire's northern frontier. These aren't official military reports or propaganda documents. They're personal letters between soldiers and their families, shopping lists, duty rosters, and informal notes between friends. In these mundane documents, we find Roman soldiers transformed from mythical figures into recognizable human beings. 1 soldier writes home requesting care packages containing underwear and socks. Another complains about the cold British weather and asks for warmer clothing. A third requests money to buy better food, since military rations were apparently inadequate for maintaining health and morale. The letters reveal soldiers struggling with homesickness, financial problems, health issues, and the psychological strain of service in hostile territory. They discuss minor illnesses, equipment failures, and the constant low-level stress of military life. These weren't superhuman warriors. They were ordinary men coping with extraordinary hardships far from home. Perhaps most poignantly, the letters show soldiers maintaining human connections across vast distances. They send greetings to family members, ask about harvest conditions back home, and share gossip about mutual friends. These fragments of personal communication remind us that behind every Roman military achievement were individual men who paid for empire with loneliness, discomfort, and separation from everything they loved. Roman military technology was undeniably advanced for its time, but technological sophistication doesn't necessarily translate to user comfort or convenience. Many pieces of Roman military equipment were engineering marvels that made their users' lives miserable. The Roman scutum, or shield, illustrates this paradox perfectly. Made from 3 layers of wood strips glued together and covered with canvas and calfskin, it was an incredibly effective defensive weapon. Its curved shape could deflect arrows, its large size provided excellent protection, and its reinforced boss could be used as an offensive weapon. But the scutum weighed between 9 and 11 pounds and was awkward to carry during long marches. Its wooden construction made it vulnerable to moisture, which could cause the laminated layers to separate and the shield to fall apart. In wet weather, soldiers had to constantly protect their shields from rain while simultaneously using them for protection from enemy missiles. The famous gladius, The short, stabbing sword that became synonymous with Roman military might was equally problematic. While effective in close combat, it required soldiers to get within arm's reach of their enemies, exposing them to maximum danger. The short blade that made it perfect for tight formations also made it nearly useless in individual combat against enemies with longer weapons. Even the pilum, the heavy javelin that was one of Rome's most effective weapons, created problems for the soldiers who carried it. Each soldier carried 2 pila, adding 8 to 12 pounds to their load. The long, unwieldy weapons were difficult to carry during marches and nearly impossible to use effectively in close quarters. Roman military equipment was optimized for battlefield effectiveness, not soldier comfort or convenience. Every piece of gear that made Roman armies more effective also made individual soldiers' lives more difficult. The Roman Empire operated on an implicit social contract. Soldiers would endure unimaginable hardships in exchange for the promise of eventual prosperity and social advancement. This contract was fundamentally dishonest, based on promises the state could not or would not keep. Roman society celebrated military virtue while systematically exploiting the men who embodied it. Triumphant generals received heroes' welcomes and vast wealth, while the soldiers who made victory possible struggled to afford basic necessities. The contradiction was built into the empire's foundation. Rome's glory depended on maintaining a permanent underclass of warrior laborers. The recruitment system targeted the empire's most desperate citizens: landless peasants, urban poor, and men with few economic alternatives. Military service was marketed as a path to social mobility, but the reality was a trap that kept soldiers in poverty while extracting decades of labor from their bodies. Veterans who survived their service often discovered that promised land grants were located in dangerous frontier regions, far from civilization and vulnerable to enemy attack. The retirement they had earned through 25 years of hardship was often just another form of military service, as veteran colonies were expected to serve as first-line defense against barbarian invasions. Even successful veterans faced challenges integrating back into civilian society. After decades of military life, many found it difficult to adapt to peaceful occupations. Their bodies, broken by years of carrying massive loads and enduring harsh conditions, were often unsuited for civilian labor. The skills that made them effective soldiers, violence, discipline, endurance, had limited application in peacetime economy. Archaeological discoveries across the Roman Empire consistently reveal evidence of the hardships described in historical sources. Skeletal remains of Roman soldiers show patterns of injury and disease that tell stories of chronic suffering. Bone analysis reveals high rates of arthritis, particularly in the spine, knees, and ankles, exactly what we would expect from men who spent careers carrying heavy loads across long distances. Soldiers' remains show evidence of repeated stress fractures in the feet and lower legs, caused by marching in heavy, rigid footwear on hard surfaces. Dental evidence reveals nutritional deficiencies consistent with poor quality military rations. Despite the empire's agricultural abundance, soldiers often suffered from malnutrition, suggesting that feeding armies was a lower priority than feeding civilian populations or maintaining military infrastructure. Excavations of Roman military camps reveal living conditions that were Spartan even by ancient standards. Barracks were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and lacking in basic amenities. The contrast with contemporary civilian architecture is striking. Roman cities featured sophisticated urban planning, while military camps remained primitive and uncomfortable. Even officer accommodations were modest compared to civilian housing of equivalent social status. The Roman military operated on the principle that comfort was weakness, creating institutional cultures that celebrated unnecessary hardship as character-building virtue. The Roman Empire was not built by gleaming heroes in perfect armor marching triumphantly across continents. It was built by suffering men carrying crushing loads, wearing clothes that provided minimal comfort, and living in conditions that modern armies would consider inhumane. These soldiers, Marius's mules, were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were economic conscripts, driven to military service by poverty and kept there by debt. The equipment that made them effective also made their lives miserable, The training that gave them legendary endurance also broke their bodies. The promise of eventual reward motivated them to endure decades of hardship that most would never survive to collect. The brutal truth about Roman soldiers' clothing is that it was designed not for their comfort or benefit, but for the empire's needs. Every thread, every piece of metal, every leather strap was calculated to maximize military effectiveness while minimizing cost to the state. The human cost was irrelevant as long as the system continued producing effective armies. When you see Roman soldiers depicted in movies, television, or popular culture, remember the reality behind the myth. Those gleaming warriors carrying light loads and wearing comfortable uniforms are fantasies created by people who never had to march 20 miles while carrying 80 pounds of equipment. The real Roman soldiers were ordinary men whose extraordinary suffering built extraordinary civilization. The next time you drive on a straight road, cross a stone bridge, or see running water flowing through pipes, remember that these marvels of Roman engineering were paid for not just with taxes and labor, but with the broken bodies and shattered dreams of men who carried the weight of empire on their shoulders. The Roman Empire's greatest achievement was not its architecture, its laws, or its cultural legacy. It was convincing millions of men to sacrifice their health, comfort, and lives for promises the state never intended to keep. In that sense, the empire's most successful technology was not military equipment or engineering. It was the manipulation of human desperation and hope. The brutal truth about Roman soldiers' clothing is that it was never really about clothing at all. It was about power, exploitation, and the price ordinary people pay for extraordinary civilizations. That truth remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago.